So this is a lecture by Dr. Todd Shaw at the University of South Carolina in the Department of Political Science. All rights reserved for this intellectual property. And this is a lecture for the course of POLI 201, American National Government at the University of South Carolina. This lecture is on topic C3, campaigns and elections. This the broader rubric under which this particular lecture falls is the section on the practice of American citizenship. Certainly, campaigns and elections provide sort of the institutional context for citizen participation, but without citizens engaging in voting, which is the previous section, engaging in processes of political participation or volunteering with a campaign or in contributing to a campaign or doing other activity, without them having that practice of citizenship, those citizenship practices of citizen engagement or civic engagement, then what would be the purpose of campaigns and elections in a democratic society? So what I'm going to do in this lecture is talk about the sort of the rules and procedures of campaigns and elections in the United States, focusing very directly on the presidential election. But we're going to think about congressional elections, both in the House and the Senate, and talk about a few dynamics of them as well. And this is the election. This is the particular lecture where we'll talk about the Electoral College. Okay, my opening story. So we've not shied away from some of the more contentious issues of the current sort of debates and really kind of fights in Washington. And certainly one of these ongoing debates or fights is around the question of whether or not the Russian government or actors of the Russian government hacked the 2016 election and provided a direct way to interfere with the election. So for nearly the past year, as of the time of this taping of this lecture, there's been a sort of deep partisan divide around this question, the appointment of Robert Mueller as a special prosecutor to investigate these questions of Russian interference. And then in the 2016 presidential election, it's certainly been a hot topic. There's also, of course, charges and counter charges within the Trump administration or against the Trump administration, whether or not members of the Trump campaign staff colluded with Russians to swing the election. So there are all these very contentious and kind of very extraordinary charges going on, although there was interference or some findings of interference from the Chinese government in under the Clinton administration during an election period. But this most recent period is around the question of whether or not the Russian government interfered. And of course, the presumption is that or by one argument, particularly from the Democratic side, did they interfere in the election in opposition to Hillary Clinton to swing the election toward Trump. So that's the broad, very controversial set of charges that is, of course, President Trump and his administration, his spokespersons are vigorously arguing are not true, are fake news. Well, I showed you a clip from CNN the last time. Let me be, quote unquote, fair and balanced and show you a clip from Fox News around whether or not the Russian government or Russian actors used Facebook as a means to gin up opposition, gin up or mobilize individuals in in ways that would have disadvantaged Hillary Clinton and advantaged Donald Trump and his campaign. So we're going to watch just a clip from this news segment where a Fox News or Fox News related anchor is interviewing a former Clinton staffer. I don't think of this 2016 campaign, but of the 2012 campaign. And the staffer is making a case about how, in fact, it's problematic to assume that interference or collusion could have swung the election.
Saving is absolutely key.
Yeah,
What happens
we have
if
to
you
watch a
want to
few
buy a
commercials.
house? That can be a big chunk of change. Good.
Facebook Chief Operating Officer Sheryl Sandberg made the rounds on Capitol Hill last week amid the growing furor over Moscow's use of social media to influence the 2016 presidential election. The company revealed last month that a Russian firm with links to the Kremlin bought more than $100,000 worth of ads on Facebook between June 2015 and May 2017. But would that be enough to influence the outcome of a presidential race? Mark Penn is managing director of the Stagwell Group. He was chief strategist on Bill Clinton's 1996 presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton's 2000 Senate campaign, and Mrs. Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. So, Mark, welcome. Good to see you.
Nice to correct it.
Thank you. You wrote an intriguing piece for us this week suggesting that $100,000 can't buy an election. Why don't you explain that?
Well, look, the premise of the piece is enough fake news about fake news. That if you just took a little simple math, Facebook told us that 56% were spent after the election. So only $44,000 could even have been in the election period. That most of it didn't refer to a candidate, that most of it was not in swing states. By the time you do the simple math, you get down to about $6,500 may have been in swing states during the year of the election. It's incredible that we're spending all this time talking about something like that just a little math explodes.
All right, but there's a sort of a sense that I get talking to Democrats that says, you know, this election was so close in those key Midwestern states, so close in Wisconsin, that if foreign agents, foreign sources just poured a little money into those districts with a message that looked to be anti-Clinton or anti-Obama, then you could actually influence the election in those states and turn the Electoral College.
I wish that it was so easy. I mean, $2.4 billion were spent on this presidential election. Hillary Clinton had a $400 million advantage over Donald Trump. And just in the last week, her super PAC put $6 million into Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida to suggest that a few $1,000s of these incredibly targeted ads, which they weren't, they didn't even know when the election day was, is ludicrous. And we have to be honest with ourselves. Whether this argument hurts or helps Democrats, we have to have some honest, fact-based discussions in this country.
All right. You compared this in your piece to what the Chinese tried to do in 1996, and we know there were, there's an attempt by foreign agents there to influence the campaign on behalf of Bill Clinton. But you say, that wasn't decisive either.
Well, it wasn't decisive. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was probably bigger, and of course money meant a little bit more in 1996. It was probably bigger, but we kept it in proportion. We did investigate it. There were some fundraisers who were prosecuted. It was clear the Chinese government had a, quote, China plan. Mm-hmm. No, it wasn't decisive, but we didn't make it a national fixation. We tightened up validation procedures about foreign contributions, and we should tighten up fake accounts and, clearing ads and things like that. We should clear that up. We should take this as a warning that this wasn't something that really made a difference, but somebody could in the future.
All right, so your advice to Facebook, Twitter, and social media sites would be basically you're going to have to dig into who the sources of these things, these ads are in the next election and make sure you screen out these foreign-sourced ads, because obviously if we knew that a Russian ad was buying a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal, for example, attacking a candidate, we wouldn't take the money.
Well, technically, the Supreme Court has protected non-candidate issue communications. So Facebook has a lot of issues to consider. I guess the point is, look, in good faith, you should have the basic procedures that a lot of TV stations have for ads, that you run through political ads. You should really do your best on fake accounts and make sure this doesn't become a real problem because because we got so overheated here in doing this. It could become a real problem, but it wasn't.
Okay.
All right. So I wanted to show you just that section. Or just I wanted to show you that particular segment from a Fox News program. And I am going to show you various segments in my opening stories from various media outlets as one set of stories. And I'm not endorsing that story one way or another, but I thought it was an intriguing way to talk about very, very currently, how do we think about how do we think about our electoral process? In what ways do Americans have faith in their electoral process? And what are the possible flaws or problems or issues of the electoral process? In this case, just a question of whether or not there is a certain integrity to the electoral process, and how can campaigns wittingly or unwittingly engage in things, and that's the argument that is being argued against, that campaigns can or cannot be corrupted in the process. So anyway, this is going to be an ongoing discussion, an ongoing debate, and I just thought I'd give you one slice of one story or one perspective on that debate. Okay, so let's talk about the following things in this lecture. Let's talk about candidates, issues, and resources. In what ways do candidates matter, or campaigns matter, as I will make the case? And in fact, I will argue to you, class, that candidates and campaigns, or candidates and issues together matter. That is not just our candidate-centered electoral process, or just that people care passionately about issues, and whoever pushes that issue, that's the person they follow. It's the conjunction of the two that really matter. And how do resources fuel the process and ensure that campaigns can mobilize folk behind their particular candidate? But then what are if you don't mind me using this term, biases of the resource processing campaign? How are money in politics? How does money sway politics? How does money not sway politics? And the clip you just heard gave some indication of that. And then what are the rules in politics of elections in our electoral process? What's the rules of the rules of the road? What are the rules of the game of politics and elections in the American political system? And then we'll take a look at the presidential electoral process, the presidential election process. Most specifically, we'll look at the electoral college. All right, so I'm going to get back around to these two pictures on the left-hand side. We're going to see a clip in just a moment. But I want to highlight these two broad points in talking about and introducing the ways in which candidates, resources, and issues, or candidates, issues, and resources, I think I worded it differently in the last slide, matter. So, and as soon as it stops spinning, I'll talk. Okay, so elections or voter preferences can depend upon candidates, party attachment, and issues raised in a campaign. And I'm going to stress that each of these particular factors matter. They don't matter in and of themselves, but they matter in conjunction with each other, particularly if we're thinking about two things. A, how are persons mobilized to get out to vote? And B, once they get out to vote, what are the choices they make in the voting booth? So we can't think about them just in isolation. We kind of have to think about them all together. Then secondly, we want to talk about candidates sort of use different party attachments and slants on the issue to shape voter preferences. So the candidates are about getting their supporters to the polls. Sometimes in a slightly nefarious way to think about this, campaigns may choose to subtly demobilize the opposition. If we're talking about it being truly nefarious, sort of demobilize the opposition or give sort of misinformation. But that's a little more rare in American politics. What's more often the case is that folk are trying to, positively get out their base of people to vote for them, as opposed to spending a lot of time of trying to demobilize or confuse the opposition, which takes a lot of effort and energy and has certainly its political risk. Now, one clear way you and I can suspect, or you and I know, and we certainly can further speculate about, one clear way in which folks mobilize voters for their cause is the campaign literature or material they put out there to brand themselves. And in the emergence of the modern medium of television and everything else that's a sort of modern media, and of course social media is our most current form of engagement with individual voters. In the emergence of sort of the modern TV commercial, most specifically to talk about sort of slants on issues, there's two TV commercials that have gone down in history as being the most effective campaign commercials of our time. Among the most effective, I should say, and not the only, but the most effective. The first campaign commercial I'm showing you on the left-hand side is a campaign commercial run by President Lyndon B. Johnson when he was running for election to a full term. And if you recall from American history, President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. Johnson took over as vice president to become president, succeeded him as president, served out the remainder of his term, and wanted to run for re-election. Well, Johnson's competitor in that election, Johnson was a Democrat. His competitor in that election was Barry Goldwater from Arizona. And Goldwater represented sort of the would emerge to become sort of the new voice within the Republican Party. As the Republican Party, it's a long story, we'll get into it later, but as the Republican Party became more solidly a conservative party, or the party of the conservative movement. Well, Johnson was trying to scare the wits out of people in not voting for Barry Goldwater. And so he ran a commercial that is called the Daisy Girl commercial, or is popularly called the Daisy commercial. It is probably, again, as I said a moment ago, probably one of the most singularly effective commercials ever run in a campaign. It ran, as I understand my political history, it only ran once, but it only needed to run once by virtue of what Lyndon Johnson did in that commercial. Now, another very effective commercial is that by Ronald Reagan. And by the way, I'm going to show you these commercials in a moment. But another effective commercial was run by President Ronald Reagan, as he was running for re-election 20 years later after Johnson. And Reagan, of course, was running as the nominee, or what he became. Certainly, he was solidly endorsed as the nominee of the Republican Party. And he was the incumbent president, and a popular incumbent president, particularly among conservatives and moderates. Now, whereas Johnson's commercial was highly negative, Ronald Reagan's commercial was highly positive. It's put, again, one of the most positive spins upon, and I say spin in an objective way, not in a derisive way, positive spins on a incumbent president's administration. It was, as you'll see, it's a very hopeful commercial. It literally is a commercial about sunrises. It's morning again in America. And so let me show you these two commercials and juxtapose these two commercials in making the point about how candidates try to use various slants to shape voter preferences. Okay, first the Daisy Girl commercial.
One, two, three, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9, 9.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
I know, like, wow. Every time I see that commercial, I have to laugh a little because, you can't state it any more starkly than to say, vote or die. So again, as I recall my American political history, this commercial only ran once, but it only had to run once. What was Johnson doing? Clearly, you know what he was doing. He was trying to say that Barry Goldwater was a clear extremist. Barry Goldwater, and that you vote for Barry Goldwater and we will have nuclear war, or nuclear holocaust. So Johnson was making the point in this commercial that as a spin upon Goldwater's stance at the Republican National Convention when he said, and I paraphrase him, defense of liberty, extremism as a defense of liberty is no vice. And so because Johnson tagged Goldwater with these ideas that extremism is just fine, it's important patriotic value, Johnson pushed it to the limit, and particularly, of course, we're in the midst of the Cold War with the Russians. So he says, well, if you elect Johnson the president, he'll push the button, and we will be no more. Certainly, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, as incumbent president, tried to tag Donald Trump with the same label of extremism, and had relative success if we look at the popular vote, but we'll get around to what really mattered, which of course is the electoral vote. Okay, so let me then turn to Ronald Reagan's Morning in America. It's Morning in America. Entirely different spin to this commercial.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history.
Sorry, so fuzzy.
With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes.
Terribly fuzzy.
More than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
Yeah, it was a very short commercial, but very effective commercial because it portrayed this sort of sense of ebullient optimism. Reagan had brought back in his administration this new dawn of American promise. And Reagan, for all what his critics may have said about him in terms of him turning back the Great Society programs, was a very effective communicator. He was, his critics and his supporters alike dubbed him the great communicator. His ability to convey very powerfully and very poignantly language to the American people. So you can see two incumbent presidents using very different spins and using them effectively because they both won their re-elections or their elections. And so this is one example of how campaigns and candidates sort of use different slants to shape voters' preferences. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot at the end of this lecture about the 2016 campaign. We're in an American politics course. We certainly ought to talk about current issues, and we don't shy away from current issues, though there are plenty of debates and controversies to discuss. But I want to sort of give you one particular introduction to our discussion of the 2016 campaign. And I'll do that by saying, okay, well, what was the slant, or what were the ways in which Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump spoke to their strengths as candidates? And you probably could sum it up as Clinton portraying herself with a certain level of gravitas and experience, former senator, former secretary of state, had a very long resume in terms of her experience. So experience and steadiness, in a steady hand, a steady understanding of policy, a stateswoman. On the other side, in very stark contrast, Donald Trump portraying himself as a businessman, someone who shakes things up, who never held elected office, and thus, in fact, what makes him more qualified to bring about a real shakeup in Washington. And so being someone who is a maverick, someone who challenges the status quo. Those are probably the particular brands that each of these candidates brought to their campaign. Well, we're going to talk about other factors that shape voter preferences other than candidates branding themselves. And that is, what is the strength of partisanship? How do the party divides matter in mobilization? How deeply divided or polarized are party preferences or preferences among those who have partisan attachments? Then we'll look at the degree to which candidates make direct contact with voters. We're in an era, and we've been in this era a while, where we can use technology very effectively to micro-target individuals. You can literally know who voted for who the last election and go just to those doors, send your workers just to those doors to target or micro-target those individuals. But along with candidate contact on one side, there's also the issue that you'll continue to hear me talk about throughout the latter parts of this course, and that's the incumbency advantage. Those who are already elected to office, what advantage do they have in maintaining their advantage for re-election? And it's a fairly significant one, particularly when we talk about persons who are re-elected to the House of Representatives, but to a lesser degree, the U.S. Senate. Then we want to talk about sort of broader situational or contextual factors like the state of the economy. Okay, and that's one factor that, beyond other factors, truly matter. All right, now I will say, class, that you'll notice that I didn't sort of highlight in this version of my online lecture. I did not highlight the principles of politics. I will get back around to that when I deliver this lecture in class. But I thought I'd give you the other parts of this lecture and then give you that specific part in class. So your authors highlight in their text, Lowe et al. Highlight in their text a theorem that stems from rational choice theory. And although rational choice is a principle, it is a broader paradigm that political scientists, economists, psychologists, others have used to say, how can we be somewhat predictive of what people will do based on what they see as their rational self-interest, or as economists more directly say, as they see their utility, the benefit they derive from a particular outcome, a particular behavior, a particular decision. Now, there's a lot technicality to medium voter theorem, to the medium voter theorem. But here's the most basic sort of, or one of the basic ways to state that theorem or to explain that theorem. It was presented by Duncan Black and Anthony Downs, and Anthony Downs has been a pivotal, or he's provided pivotal theories to political scientists in the form of him being an economist. And the medium voter theorem states that the candidate who takes an issue position that is closest to a majority of the voters, or the median voter, especially in a general election, is best positioned to win. So let's say that each of these X's along this axis is a particular issue position on any issue you want to think about, or it might be a range of positions on issues. And let's say that this particular axis goes from 0 to 100. And it's simply, it's not an indicator of strength, it's just an indicator of direction. So let's say 0 is on the left or liberal side, and 100 is on the conservative or right side. So each of these distributions, each of these bell curves represent, is a simplification, but a representation of voters in the population, or positions or clusters of voters in the electorate where various voters fall. So on the right-hand side, you have a group of voters who see themselves as very conservative, and on the left-hand side, you see a group of voters who see themselves as very liberal, and folks sort of in the middle being more moderate. Well, the median voter theory says median, middle. The middle vote position is the safest. Let me restate that. The middle or median vote position is the best position for a candidate to take, assuming that this distribution holds, in order to win an election, particularly if you're running in a general election. We'll get more into this, but whereas in primary elections for political parties, you have candidates run toward the extremes because that's, or maybe extreme is the wrong way to say it, or polls, because that's where their electorate falls. So in a Democratic election or a Democratic primary to nominate Democratic candidates, you're going to have most of the positions being taken on this left-hand side. Many fewer voters are going to be here on the right side. Same thing in a conservative or Republican primary. More voters on the right-hand side, fewer voters on the left-hand side. But in a general election where you have the entire electorate, candidates who start here need to move to the center, in their issue positions in order to capture more of the total electorate. So the conservative candidate needs to move as close to here, relatively speaking, to get, and again, this is a simplification, but these are groupings of 25 voters, or we can say 25,000, doesn't matter. But you need to move more toward the center, maybe not completely center, but more toward the median voter in order to capture the majority of these three humps on this side. Same thing with liberal voters on the left-hand side. So I hope that kind of helps you understand this important principle of rational choice theory, that it sort of has a mathematical, if you will, a mathematical equation or mathematical solution to a political principle. Okay. So candidates and issues. The combination of candidates and issues matter. And this is an argument made by various political scientists around the question of, is it issues or candidates? No, it's kind of both. And I am one of the political scientists who makes that argument, that you can't just simply say, well, voters only care about issues. Well, no, singularly they don't. Or they only care about candidates. Well, if the candidates aren't quite pushing the issues that they're concerned about, or at least voters aren't convinced they are, whether or not they are or not, then that doesn't quite work. issue stances give voters a rationale for why they would vote for so and so. You can't say you vote for so and so. Well, I vote for so and so because I like, so and so smiles nicely. People could, but more voters than not would see that as that's not a very that's a sort of nonsensical thing. You sort of just like the way the guy smiles. That's a nonsensical reason to cast your vote. You care about issues that he or she the issues that he or she cares about that have a direct bearing upon you and your family. So it's a combination of the two. This particular graphic from the 2008 campaign, which issue matters the most in how you voted for president? So the issue included the economy, healthcare. The issues included the economy, healthcare, terrorism, the war in Iraq, energy policy. And you can see in 2008, because of the beginning of the Great Recession, 63% of all voters who are part of this exit poll, I should say, this NBC exit poll, said that was the most important issue. Well, 63% of those who said the economy was most important, of that 63%, 53% of those voters voted for Obama, 44% for McCain. McCain was the candidate of the incumbent party in the White House. McCain was a Republican. The incumbent president, George W. Bush, was or is a Republican. So it was both the fact that Obama, came in as this new candidate, this new challenger, and that fundamentally mattered. Of course, Obama had lots of money, and he's an eloquent individual. So all those things sort of added to it, along with the historic first of being African American. So all of these things may have had some bearing, but it also had some bearing upon the fact of the issues that matter. So it's both the issues and the candidates. Now, on the other side, Obama won that election. I should point that out. And the economy was a main issue. But it didn't mean that McCain didn't have his strengths. Of those voters, although only 9%, 86% of that 9% voted for McCain. Of those who cared about the war in Iraq, because they were critical of the Bush administration going to war in Iraq, 59% of them voted for Obama, whereas 39% for McCain. Energy policy, whereas those who cared about energy policy or thought our energy policy should be rooted in oil production is part of the inference of the question. 5% for Obama, 46% for McCain. So again, I'm making the point that both candidates and issues matter. All right. Now let's talk about partisanship. In 2016, let's bring it forward. The Democrats and Republicans clearly voted for their party candidates, but independents leaned more toward Trump. So we can see that there was a clear divide in this election, and we'll continue to talk about these divides. But 89% of Democrats voted for Clinton. 2% of independents voted for Clinton. Yes, 2% of it, if I got that right. No, among Democrats, I'm sorry. 89% voted for Clinton. Among Democrats, 2% voted for someone else, and 9% voted for Trump. Among Republicans, 90% voted, so just the inverse in some ways. 90% voted for Trump, 3% voted for someone else, and 7% voted for Clinton. So it was almost, relatively speaking, the polar opposites of each other. Among independents, and this is where it was key in the election, 49% of independents voted for Trump, so these critical swing voters. 10% voted for somebody else, and 42% voted for Clinton. Okay? But if you look at these bars, and if you could put independents in the middle, all the same. The independents were sort of literally divided, although a larger percentage, a plurality of them voted for Trump. But you can see these two bars as clearly sort of mirror images of each other. So there was high polarization. Wasn't a lot of crossover voting. Clearly not a lot of crossover voting between Republicans and Democrats. All right. So as we think about further about this question of candidates, resources, and issues, let's talk about the incumbent advantage issue. Now, as you can imagine, if you're already elected to office or you have been elected to office several times, then you have certain clear benefits from voting for being in office. So among those are, you have name recognition. That's one clear advantage. Secondly, you have a longer campaign period because, in effect, you can campaign while in office, and the ability to campaign while in office matters. You have the sort of whole time you're in office to make a case. You can send out mail saying, hey, constituents, here's what I'm doing. Here's how I'm benefiting you. Then you have clear media attention. You have media attention because you are the sitting senator. You can go out and make appearances that are veiled campaign appearances, or they are directly campaign appearances. But you have the local newspapers. You have the local television stations. You have national television stations. You have national social media paying attention to what you say because you are in office. Or, national if you're at a national office, local if you're at a local office. Okay. Then you have the money advantage that political action committees, as we'll talk about, which are private groups that support various candidates under certain campaign laws. You have a money advantage because you will probably already have a campaign chest that you haven't completely exploited from your last campaign. You may have more. May have money that you can continue to use. And you have the advantage that you can gain more supporters because you may be, depending upon where you stand in the polls, the safer bet. Then you can do constituency service, and we'll talk about this relative to Congress. But this constituency service matters in that you can make a case to constituents about how you're directly benefiting them and serving them. Members of Congress care a lot about constituency service. When someone calls them up, someone sends a letter saying, I need some assistance. I'm a veteran. I need some assistance. I'm a senior citizen and I need assistance relative to Social Security. It would be unwise for an incumbent, to not dedicate real resources to answering constituent mail, to being attentive to constituents, to meeting constituents when they come on Capitol Hill. I'm using an example of Congress, but we can use other offices in the American political system. All of these things are really important, but that constituent service can make a difference. There's one senator in the state of South Carolina, Senator Strong Thurmond, now passed by a decade. He's been passed or dead more than a decade now. But Strong Thurmond was known as being sort of this very boilerplate constituent service senator. He would send senior citizens throughout the state birthday cards on their birthdays. And a whole raft of other things that he would do toward constituent service. And he was a Republican, but it didn't matter if you were a Democrat or Republican, you'd get a birthday card from Strong Thurmond, particularly those who were his seniors. So that type of attentiveness to constituent needs also helps give a certain advantage to incumbents, particularly when, of course, they're running for re-election. All right, now let's talk about the incumbent advantage relative to money. And this is, I'm showing you in this graphic, the Obama's 2012 incumbency effect in one respect. Now, it's important to note that given the ways in which the parties project themselves, the brands that they have, the coalitions that they build, it is more often the case than not that Republicans have at least some advantage when it comes to raising money over their Democratic opponents. That doesn't mean it's a wide advantage, and it's certainly not a wide advantage in every election, but there are some advantages because of the sort of business and affluent constituents that may be parts of the Republican Party, that they can have some slight advantage when it comes to money, but not always an advantage, and not an advantage in every instance. And I'm not doing that as a slap against the Republican Party. I'm being objective to talk about what's the real actual constituents within the party. So in 2012, as this graphic is showing you, Barack Obama had raised roughly, and this was as of September 21st, or shortly before, 2 or so months, not quite 2 months before the election. Obama raised somewhere north of about $775 million and spent $606 million. Mitt Romney raised $784 million, his challenger, and spent $534 million. Now, the interesting thing in this regard is if you come down to these categories here, you'll notice that the national parties, the DNC raised $220 million, where the RNC, the Republican National Committee, raised $283 million. The Democrats were a bit outspent or outraised by the Republicans, but Obama, as a presidential candidate, raised $441 million to Romney's $284 million. Super PACs greatly leaned toward the Republicans then over Democrats in this particular graphic. But it's interesting, right, that the incumbent president, if you just look at the campaign, raised twice the amount of money as his competitor. That didn't mean he had twice the amount of money to spend when you added all the sources together. But he, as the incumbent president, raised twice as much money. And that clearly gave him an advantage that he otherwise wouldn't have if he wasn't an incumbent, because, of course, Mitt Romney didn't have that advantage. Okay. Now, but money isn't everything. And particularly money isn't everything if you are not the incumbent. If you're not an incumbent. You heard from the earlier discussion in the first clip that I showed you that Hillary Clinton greatly outraised Donald Trump. So Hillary Clinton raised, by the end of the campaign, roughly $1 billion. That's a heck of a lot of money. And she and Obama still sort of hold the records in American political elections for raising the most money. But Obama was a incumbent who won re-election. Clinton did not win the election, though, of course, we'll talk about the differences between her winning the popular vote but not the electoral vote. Donald Trump raised $646 million. So again, she outraised him by $400 million. But he won the electoral vote in being very strategic. Arguably, again, she won more votes, but she didn't win votes in the right place, in the right places, as we'll talk about. And that's what really matters in our electoral system. Okay, so again, money's not everything, and money is not the absolute determiner as to the outcome, particularly if we're talking about the rules of the presidential campaign. All right, now let's talk about other ways in which the incumbent advantage matters or does not matter. And this data is dated a bit. It really is a bit dated because it comes from 1990 from the work of Jacobson, Gary Jacobson. But it really is always been a fascinating graphic to me because it talks about if you have a challenger versus an incumbent running for Congress, and what did Jacobson find? And elements of what Jacobson reports in this graphic certainly has held true for a number of years. So here's the categories of the chart saying, well, by what percentage or what's the likelihood of the person sort of winning or losing? And this is all about the challenger. Did the challenger to a congressional seat win or lose? And what was in what cases were they more likely to win versus lose? So if there was a gap in recall, in other words, the voter couldn't recall their name, then the incumbent was much more likely to win. If there was a gap in recognition, or you knew the candidate, but you couldn't remember her or his name, or a gap in recognition. I don't even know who you are and you're running. Clearly, the incumbent was more likely to win. And so the challenger was much more likely to lose. But what helped the challenger? If they had stronger degree of contact with the voter, if they particularly if they were the sole person who came to a voter's door and said, vote for me, that was a clear indicator, that was a clear advantage for the challenger and their likelihood of winning. If they had greater print coverage than the incumbent, then, in newspapers, again, 1990, they were more likely to win. If they had better and more extensive TV ads and coverage, they were more likely to win. So here's the factors where challengers lost. Here's the factors where they won. We can make inferences about in what ways incumbency matters and doesn't, and may or may not matter. And this is interesting, but let's get to the rates at which incumbents are actually turned out or not elected in Congress. That won't be a very heartening story. Oops, I went backwards and didn't mean to. Okay. So let's talk about the state of the economy. And these graphics are coming directly from your textbook. I use this textbook because I think there's a lot of interesting things found in it. Wish there were more pictures, but that's another story. But I do think these graphics that they present are quite intriguing. And so the graphics that Loy et al. Present about the state of the economy and assessments of a candidate's likelihood of winning based upon voters' perception of the economy, they're, again, quite interesting. What I say here in this bullet point, and I show you two graphics here, or two charts. Initially, there's little relationship between voter supporter for the incumbent party and perceived business conditions. So all of the sort of brightly yellow dots, or orange dots, I guess I should say, are when an incumbent was not running in a presidential election. And both persons who were running were challengers. Then the blue is an incumbent is running. So these dots, and these are the perceived business conditions, where voters are saying, and the percent the incumbent party is likely to, the percent of support the voter has for the incumbent party, or the person who is the incumbent. So this particular axis is showing where did the voters perceive the economy, or what did the voter perceive to be the state of the economy. Dots that are further here means the economy not so good. Dots further around here, the economy quite good. And you can see these dots are kind of all over the map. Even when you had in 1980 and 1992 voters not being terribly thrilled about the economy, they were still supporting incumbents. And when they had a fairly high assessment of the economy, they were supporting the challengers. But this was in April, early on in the election. But as campaigns progress, voters begin to support challengers due to these perceptions. And so these dots begin to sort themselves out. Whereas to some degree, particularly if you're talking about 1980, to 2008, 1980, and 1992, and here are the incumbents, Jimmy Carter, as well as George Bush, Democrat, Republican, were essentially were not reelected because of the state of the economy. And so candidates in each of these elections, in this case, Ronald Reagan, in this case, it was Bill Clinton, but also to some degree Ross Perot, made a strong case about, turn the bum out because the economy is bad. Clearly Obama won for the state of the economy. The economy is abysmal according to voters' perceptions, and he, as a challenger, clearly won in that sense. But it was he didn't win against an incumbent, but he did win against in some respects, although George Bush couldn't run against him, he did win against his Republican challenger, which would have been a third term for a Republican in the White House. So two concepts I want to highlight here is that of prospective voting and retrospective voting. Prospective voting is where voters assess a candidate according to an imagined future performance. So I elect this person because I think he's going to be good for me in the future. He's going to go ahead and do certain things that I believe in. Retrospective voting says you assess a candidate based on past performance. She has been a reliable representative. She's been a reliable governor. I like what she's done. I'm going to vote for her again. Okay, so straightforward. Prospective future, retrospective past. All right. So the graphic on the right here is from the congressional redistricting. And I'll let you work through, and we might talk a little bit more in lecture about the fairly detailed, fairly complicated process of how do you draw districts for congressional elections within states. And it is a pretty complicated process. And it advantages incumbent parties, particularly incumbent parties within state legislatures. Okay, so this is how this is an important consideration as we get into the rules in politics of elections. Redistricting. Article 1 of the Constitution requires a decennial census, or every 10-year U.S. census, to serve as the basis for reapportioning seats for the U.S. House of Representatives. So the Constitution sort of lays out in broad respects, and law and Congress filling in the law lays out in particular respects, how you will go about sort of creating using the census, understanding how many people live where in how many states, using that census as a basis to create districts. And I will go through at least the first couple of steps. The Census Bureau, so you have the decennial census. The Census Bureau applies a mathematical formula called method of equal proportions to determine the number of congressional seats to which each state is now entitled. Some states gain seats, some states lose seats, others remain unchanged. Why? Some states gain population, some seats lose population, others remain unchanged. Then party strategists examine census findings, seat gains and losses, and voting data to try to develop state-by-state districting formulas that will help their party. Strategists also examine election laws and recent court decisions. And then it kind of goes from there, particularly as we get to the state level, and state legislatures and legislative commissions hold hearings to develop rules and procedures for redistricting, and new district boundaries are drawn with it being passed by the incumbent party, or probably by the majority party. All right. Now, here we get the term of gerrymandering. And gerrymandering comes from Jerry Aldridge of New Jersey, who was said to have drawn a district that was like a gerrymander dragon. And so his name, Jerry, his name being associated with this fictitious character or dragon, because it approximated this very serpentine district that was created for his benefit, is stuck throughout American history. And so at issue is what basis state legislatures and thus state parties may use to redraw congressional districts. Can the party in power draw districts that greatly advantage it? So we have a Supreme Court decision now, or Supreme Court decision forthcoming in Wisconsin. And it could be the Democratic or Republican Party. But if you, let's say, and this is the actual scenario, let's say that you win 49% of the vote in a legislative race. In other words, of all the votes cast in the state, your party wins. Let's say it this way. Your party wins 51% of the seats, or 51% of the votes, 51% of all the votes. All the votes cast. But given legislative districting, you have 51% of the votes, but you gain 60% of the seats. just based upon how you've drawn those districts and how people run. So is that observing the one person, one vote principle? And that's currently before the court. If the court maintains and says it is constitutional, then nothing changes. If it changes, there will be a sea change in American politics because it will bring about a new level of debate among the political parties about what is a fair district. Because up to this point, the court has effectively said, although there's other considerations you have to be very careful about using, such as race and drawing districts, political party is fair game. You can have political parties advantage themselves by how they draw districts. Well, if they say you have to put boundaries on that, then that will raise a whole new level of debate in the rules around our elections and our politics. And so different rules. Just as we could draw districts differently, we could use different procedural rules to determine election outcomes. And I won't go into this in great detail, but your authors talk about and give some good discussion in that latter part of chapter 11 about the various procedural rules we could use in the United States. We'd use sort of majority winner-take-all rules in many instances. But what if you used a proportional election rule? What if a state said simply if a party has a certain percentage of the vote, it gains a certain percentage of the seats in Congress or a certain percentage of the seats in the legislature? So there are various rules we could consider using up beyond sort of majoritarian principles or plurality principles around a winner-take-all. All right. Now, let's talk about the incumbency effect again, because for all the ways in which we discuss, and we do have a vibrant democracy in the United States, there's one process that would probably shock most Americans, or maybe it wouldn't, that incumbency in Congress is very, very high. And let me point this out, and I sort of reworked two charts by Lowy et al. The first chart or table is U.S. House election results from 2000 to 2016. And it shows the rate of turnout, and then what was the party ratio in Congress, 212 Democrats to 222 Republicans. Right now, 194 Republicans to Democrats to 241 Republicans. How many seats shifted? 1 Democrat, 8 Republican, Democrats, the re-election of Democrats. What's the percentage of Democrats who ran for office who won? Other than 2010, you can see that from 2000 to 2016, nearly, 2012 was a slight exception, nearly 90% of all Democrats who ran for or ran again for office to the House of Representatives won. Same thing with Republicans, except for 2006. 90% of all Republicans who ran for office were reelected to Congress between 2000 and 2016. Now, there is a off-colored joke that says that the House of Representatives has a lesser rate of turnover than the Communist Party Politburo. That's an old American joke. But in some ways, it is true that you have these. I mean, when you're talking about 90% of everyone who is an incumbent in Congress is reelected, that's a pretty ironclad rule, right? And I'm not making up these numbers. So House districts, where does redistricting come into this issue? And redistricting isn't the only issue, but it might be one. Whereas the incumbent advantage is extremely strong in the U.S. House. So if you can redraw or have some party advantage in redrawing a district, then clearly that can have an impact upon incumbents running again. You can redistrict House. You do redistrict House districts. You don't redistrict Senate districts, and you know why. You don't redistrict states. The Senate is made up of states, is representative of states, right? So it is not quite as strong in the U.S. Senate. These rates are pretty high, or pretty really quite high as well, because you get up to 100%. But you do have some instances that fall below 100% among Democrats and also among Republicans. Still pretty high, but not quite as high as the House. And there is no redistricting because state lines are, of course, fixed. So redistricting has a certain impact upon the rules of the game, and which it does advantage. And this doesn't only prove that redistricting matters. There are other factors that matter in terms of incumbency. But certainly redistricting could be one of the culprits for why you have such a high rate of return in both houses of Congress. All right. Let's talk about another important aspect, and that's money. And we talked already about some degree of money in politics, but now let's talk about the rules of money in politics. And I won't go over this chart in detail. It comes from table 11.1 in your chapter 11. But we do have a system of hard money and soft money in American elections. And remember, I made reference to the Citizen United case that has, to a degree, and I want to be mindful of how I'm putting this to you, but it's opened a bit of the floodgates because it has loosened some of the strictures of how unions, corporations, other groups can give. That they can give in greater amounts, and they can give in some instances in unlimited amounts. That then kind of opens up more money in politics. And whether you think money in politics is a good thing or a bad thing will certainly color your view about the aspect of that decision. But when we talk about hard money, we are talking about sort of the limits that are put upon hard money. So you have individual contribution limits to candidates, to state parties, etc. You have national party limits on candidates, but no limits giving to themselves or to candidates. There are limits to give to PACs. You have state, district, and local party committees having some limits when giving to candidates, but none to national parties or to state and local party committees. And then you can run across these other indicators, political action committees. There are limits, and there can be combined limits, and the candidate committees can have some limits, but not when it's given to the state parties or to the state, district, and local party committees. You can see the money that goes to national party committees and state, district, and local party committees is probably that great sort of funnel of where monies go to in order to be indirectly routed back into campaigns. So although individuals can't give $1 million to a candidate, they can route them through the national parties, or they can give to national parties on some level. And they can bundle these amounts. So if you're giving $10,000, you talk to 10 other friends who are giving $10,000, or 9 other friends are giving $10,000, you have $100,000. So this bundling effect can take place where you coordinate how many people are giving. And so that's why you saw those numbers that I showed you earlier when it comes to national parties and state and district and local parties, because they don't have as many limits, and thus they could spend on the candidate's behalf as political action committees can spend on candidates' behalf as part of coordinated campaigns. So there are all these ways in which we have a hard money system, but we have a soft money system that has little to few limits on it. And it's the soft money that really fuels American politics in many, many respects. All right, let's talk about the presidential campaign. A couple of things to keep in mind. The modern presidential campaign is a long process. So this is 2017 as I'm giving this lecture. By this time next year, 2018, we will have individuals talking about, right after the congressional elections, who's running for president. So they'll begin that process in 2018, maybe even midsummer 2018, who's running for president, particularly on the Democratic side. But maybe there will be a Republican challenger to an incumbent President Trump. But that's all depends upon where things lie. And so that 24-month process is a long process. We have a long electoral season in the United States. Many other Western democracies do not have a 2-year electoral process. That's why Americans in some ways get exhausted by campaigns, because it is so long. And part of the long process is party primaries. Now, party primaries, as I said earlier, talking about median voter theorem, represent core voters within an electorate. They are the party, they're the intense partisans, the people who really, really care. And they're ideologically on the polls, they're at ideological polls. Really strong conservatives, really strong liberals. Party conventions are very important, but party conventions, and we could get into the whole discussion about how very different parties have different rules that they use to determine how to allocate delegates. It's very likely that the Democratic Party will have a vigorous debate about the use of superdelegates. Superdelegates are persons who are elected officials and other party elites who have a vote, who are just inherently have a vote in nominating the candidate, even though delegates are selected on the basis of who votes in primaries. But by the time you get to the party convention, there are a lot of great, a lot of branding, a lot of great speeches, a lot of platforms are made, and they are critical in some respects. But there's a lot that happens in a party convention that's really more symbolic. That many of the real decisions are made, like the real decision in the modern elections. Very rarely have we had a romped election, a romped convention, meaning that you did not know who the candidate was at least a month out from the election, given the vote tallies. So parties become national platforms, or conventions become national platforms for the parties, places where people gather together to mobilize, do a lot of partying, and talk about how do we get this person elected. And they're symbolic in the sense that they give TV coverage to the candidates, primetime TV time for the candidates to come before, or the nominees to come before the American public and to make significant speeches. So all those things are important. And symbolism is important in politics, but just to distinguish what actually goes on. Then the general election mobilizes the center of the electorate. Again, go back to my median voter theorem. And they are sort of moderate partisans. So they're folk who have attachments across the party range of party identifications. And then, well, let's discuss the Electoral College. And the Electoral College benefits larger, more competitive states, though its results often mirror the popular vote, but not always the popular vote, as we found out in the last election and in the election of 2000. So let's talk about the Electoral College. How does the Electoral College work? Remember, the basic idea behind the Electoral College is that the Electoral College, when the framers came up with it, was a means to provide a necessary distance or control upon popular control, when the framers believed that, given the expanse of this country, given the lack of level of education among the population, and that they were concerned about mass democracy, or democracy as they might have just seen it, they may have just purely called it democracy, that they wanted to give a means to have popular input, but not popular outcome relative to the election of the president. And initially, as we know, this electoral process happened within states and state legislatures, and then these electors were elected by state legislatures, and then it became democratized by virtue of the popular vote, by the direct popular vote. Okay, so let's have Professor Ichabod walk us through this. That's not me, because that's not my preference in terms of color of green. But anyway, there are 538 electors in the college. Now, it's not a college in the sense that these electors ever gather together all in one place. We have just referred to it as the college in the sense that it is a body ultimately that elects the president and the vice president. This electoral college is made of one member. These 538 electors are on the basis of one per member of Congress plus 3 members for the District of Columbia. So, 535 plus 3 is 538, or the 435 members of the House of Representatives plus the 100 members of the Senate makes 535 plus 3 makes 538. Again, math. But that's how we come up with that number. Now, when you cast your vote in your respective states, you're casting your popular vote based on the rules of that state for a slate of electors. That's who you really are voting for. And different states apportion those votes in different ways. Whether they split it according to a district, or they cast the whole state based upon plurality, but different rules, different states, but you are electing a slate of electors for that state when you cast your ballot. Then the candidate or party that gets the largest number of popular votes in the general election wins all of a state's electoral votes most of the time. There are exceptions. There are exceptions, but most of the time, the popular vote does mirror the number of electors. And so it's a general rule of thumb, although it is not true in every state. Now, in order to have a majority, 270 electoral votes are needed to win. And what happens is that these electors gather in December at each state, probably at each state capital. They formally cast their electoral votes. Those electoral votes are then communicated to Congress, to the House of Representatives, most specifically to the Senate. And they are announced announced and ratified by those bodies. If there's any discrepancy, say there's a tie or something else, then the House of Representatives decides the presidency. So the framers in their venerable wisdom decided that if you have a tie or you have a discrepancy, then the House will break the tie or discrepancy for the president, and the Senate will break the tie for the vice president. The vice president, now to say the vice president presides over the Senate is not quite right, or not quite true or factual, but the vice president is known formally as the president of the Senate. We'll get to that later. And as a result, then, you've elected a president of the United States by way of the Electoral College. We can debate ad infinitum about whether or not we dispense with the Electoral College. There are virtues and downsides to the Electoral College. The Electoral College, one of the downsides, or maybe the upsides, depending on how you think of it, one of the big picture parts of the Electoral College is that it not only matters if you vote, but where you vote. And that's sort of an interesting quirk about the Electoral College. It is kind of true in theory that your vote in South Carolina, I hate to say it, I don't feel comfortable saying it, but kind of matters a little less than California because of the number of electors that Californians elect when they cast individual ballots. But be that as it may, this is the system that we have. And let me explain its virtues, as well as, again, that might be prospectively to you, certainly might be a downside. So I'm taking this is a little dated in its representation, but it's a map that is distorted or proportionally sized according to, if you took a map of the United States and you apportioned it according to the number of electoral votes from that state. So you can see these really big blotches, like big states, include California, 55 votes in 2012, Texas, 38, Florida, 29, New York, 29, da-da-da-da-da. So here we are in South Carolina. We got 9 votes because we got 9 representatives and 2 senators, or we got 7 representatives at that time, and 2 senators. As compared to California, that had 52 representatives, or 53 representatives and 2 senators. So you can kind of see that, there is some degree to which there is a bit of a way where clearly where you vote matters as much as if you vote. But voting matters because if no one voted in South Carolina, then that would be a problem, right? Or not voting in South Carolina means that at least those 9 votes may not matter. Or 9 votes might not be counted toward the candidate you care about. But again, this is a problem of, or issue, I should say, of both place as well as behavior. Now, your vote in California or Texas weighs more than Delaware or DC. It just does by virtue of the Electoral College. But let's be clear about what the Electoral College's purpose is. The Electoral College provides finality as opposed to pure democracy. So most of the time, the Electoral College or the electoral vote and the popular vote have mirrored each other, have been both in sync. There have been several instances, 2 most recently in the 21st century, where it has not. But for the most part, it does. Here's one argument people might make. It says, for the Electoral College, let's say you had, the election of 2000, and you decided that you were going to try and decide the state of Florida, as was the case, by roughly 500 to 700 votes. And you're going to go back and count 500 to 700 votes. And you said, well, no, we want to, let me give it a little more, let me state this a little more directly. If someone said, okay, so what, you won by 1 million votes, I want a recount. I want a recount of every district, of every precinct in the United States, because I don't believe you got 1 million votes over me. Or, candidate Trump, then President Trump said, I don't believe candidate Clinton had, 2.5 million votes more than I did. I don't believe it. If we were using the electoral, popular vote, he would have called for a recount, right? And then you had to recount 2.5 million votes and come up with outcomes. So that would be a bit of a hot mess. Now, you don't get democracy in its purest form at the Electoral College, but you do get finality. The only determiner is, well, did you have enough of a vote in this state to determine the electoral outcome? So that's a pretty sure method for finality, and stability, but it's not a sure outcome for notions of pure democracy. I'll leave it there. We can debate about that later. All right. So the electoral, what were the actual outcomes of the 2006 campaign? Here's the 2016 Electoral College with a distributed popular vote. As of December 1st, 2016, Hillary Clinton led by about, we'll say, 2.5 million votes over Donald Trump in the national popular vote. That's still over 100,000 more votes than the combined total of Trump's victory in the 12 states with the narrowest margin of victory as a percentage of all votes cast. So he had a narrow but important margin in these states that then guaranteed an outcome. And particularly if we look at the states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, these critical states with their electoral votes swung the tide toward Donald Trump. And there was a very small margin of victory for Trump in those critical states, along with him holding on to and gaining, if you compare it to 2012, if we look back at 2012, and in gaining in some cases with regards to the states. Barack Obama, for instance, won North Carolina in 2008, and that was critical for him. Donald Trump won back North Carolina in 2016. So, true to the 2016 presidential election, which was contentious, the electoral and popular vote outcomes reflected very sharp and in some cases narrow divide. Again, the Electoral College provided finality in a constitutional sense. Our constitutional system gave the final verdict. But here's the electoral map. That's the map that matters, period, in terms of determining the president and the vice president of the United States. Trump won 306 electoral votes to Clinton's 232. But if you use an electoral map based on distributed popular vote upon the actual distribution of the popular vote, then Clinton would have won 423 votes to Trump's 115 votes, if we use the popular vote as the basis for the outcome, and you distributed you distributed that popular vote, that 2.5 million, not all in California, but just distributed in more evenly across the states. So this is the system we have. What happened also in the 2016 presidential election? Even though Clinton won 2.5 million more votes than Trump, there are ways in which Trump and Clinton held neck and neck with regards to the populations or the constituencies that made up their electoral coalition. Donald Trump won the electoral vote in 2016 because in comparison to Romney in 2012, he maintained or increased his percentage of the votes of men, women, senior citizens, whites, some minorities, and the affluent. Now, this is not to argue that all of these groups voted for Trump in exactly the same direction, particularly if we talk about some minority groups, but that the percentages were not. He maintained a vote percentage on par with Mitt Romney in 2016. And although Romney lost the electoral, a popular vote, he also won the electoral vote. He also lost the electoral vote as compared to Barack Obama. In other words, Obama's 5 million votes were more evenly distributed than Clinton's 2.5 million vote margin. So if you look at males leaning toward Trump and Romney, females leaning toward Clinton, but Donald Trump did not lose a significant percentage of women. The age categories remain pretty much the same. Sort of whites in the same percentage voted for Trump, even though blacks, Hispanics, and Asian Americans voted in similar numbers for Clinton. They were, in some cases, not quite as high as would have been the case for Barack Obama. And income maintained the same percentage of those, sort of a relatively even divide, except for those who were under 50,000. Just take a note, those under 50,000 sort of in 2012 were clearly more in favor of Obama than they were for Clinton in 2016. All right, we will get around to a discussion about the rules of elections, the rules of the game of elections, when we discuss briefly sort of voter photo ID laws. And the two articles I'm having you read are a little bit dated, from Chandler Davison and Hans von Spakovsky. They lay out the basic premise that are found, that we're still debating about today about voter ID laws. All right, so class, that's the end of the lecture. I will introduce the study terms and the essay questions and when I upload the slides. Thank you very much. This has been Dr. Todd Shaw at the University of South Carolina for the American National Government class, POLI 201. All rights reserved and copyrighted for this lecture being the intellectual property of Dr. Shaw. Okay, take care.